My brother-in-law was always protective of my family. When I dug into his past, I found out he wasn't a guardian, he was the person my parents had been hiding me from all along. Story 1. I'm Silas. I grew up in Ashwood Hollow, a small town in Maine with a population so small that most people know everyone else's business. Or at least, I thought they did. When my parents, Ellen and Robert, passed away in a car accident when I was 14, the town rallied around my sister Talita and me. Talita was 22 at the time, fresh out of college, and she basically became my legal guardian overnight. She did everything she could to keep me on track despite losing our parents. She was strong, dependable, and honestly, I don't know how I would have made it without her. Talita had been with Magnus for a couple of years at that point, and they got married not long after our parents died. Magnus was the kind of guy everyone liked. He worked in construction, was great with his hands, and had that salt-of-the-earth personality that made him instantly likable. He stepped up big time when my parents died. He helped Talita with the funeral arrangements, fixed up the house when things needed repairs, and even took me under his wing in a way that felt paternal. Magnus taught me how to drive, gave me summer jobs on his work sites, and always had my back. He wasn't just my brother-in-law, he was like a second father. For years, I thought Magnus was a blessing. I admired him. I wanted to be like him. But over time, little things started to nag at me. Not enough to set off alarm bells, but just enough to make me uneasy. He was protective to the point of being controlling. He always had opinions on what Talita should do, how she should raise her kids, or even how I should live my life. At the time, I chalked it up to him being overly involved, but looking back, I can see it for what it really was. The first crack in the perfect image of Magnus came about a year ago. My wife, Eliza, and I had just moved back to Ashwood Hollow after living in Boston for a few years. We wanted to be closer to family since we were starting to think about having kids. At the time, I thought it was the best decision. Being near Talita, Magnus, and their kids sounded like a dream. One night, we were having dinner at their house. The conversation turned to our parents, which was a bit unusual since Magnus rarely talked about them. Out of nowhere, he said something that stuck with me. "They did what they had to do to protect you," he said, almost wistfully, before taking a long drink of his beer. It was a strange comment, and the way he said it didn't sit right with me. When Eliza and I got home, I asked her if she thought Magnus's remark was weird. She shrugged it off, saying he probably just meant our parents were loving and protective. But something about his tone nagged at me. It didn't feel like he was just making a passing comment. It felt like he knew something I didn't. That night, I couldn't sleep. Magnus's words kept replaying in my head. The next day, I called Talita and asked her if there was something about our parents I didn't know. At first, she brushed me off, laughing nervously and saying I was overthinking things. But then she said something that sent a chill down my spine. "There are things about Mom and Dad you don't need to know," she said. "They're gone now, and none of it matters." That's when I knew she was hiding something. Talita isn't the type to be evasive, especially when it comes to family. For her to shut down the conversation like that meant whatever she was hiding was serious. I couldn't let it go. I started digging through old family papers, hoping to find anything that might explain what Talita meant. At first, it was just mundane stuff: bills, bank statements, family photos. But then I found a box labeled "Do Not Open" buried in the back of the attic. Inside were letters addressed to my parents. Most of them were from someone named Arthur Whitaker, a name I didn't recognize. The letters were strange. They weren't friendly or casual. They were warnings. One in particular stood out to me. "Ellen, I'm telling you, he's dangerous. If he finds out about the baby, he won't stop until he gets what he wants. You need to leave Everwood. Don't let him anywhere near your family." The letter was dated 2 years before I was born. I couldn't wrap my head around it. Who was Arthur? And who was this he my mom needed to protect me from? I showed the letters to Eliza, and she thought Arthur might have been a friend trying to help my parents escape a bad situation. But if that was the case, why had my parents kept his letters hidden? I became obsessed. I started researching Everwood, the small Massachusetts town my parents had lived in before moving to Ashwood Hollow. I scoured old newspapers, reached out to people who knew them, and even checked public records. Most of it led nowhere, but then I found an old neighbor who remembered my parents. "They moved here so suddenly," she told me. "Didn't talk much about where they came from. But you know what's funny? Your brother-in-law grew up in Everwood, too." My stomach dropped. Magnus had never mentioned growing up in Everwood. Why would he hide something like that? The coincidence was too big to ignore. I didn't confront him right away, but I started paying closer attention to him. And the more I watched, the more cracks I saw in his facade. Magnus was controlling in ways I hadn't noticed before. He always had to be involved in family decisions, even when they didn't concern him. He insisted on helping with things no one asked him to, like overseeing repairs on my house or giving unsolicited advice about my finances. And he had a temper, nothing explosive, but it was there, simmering beneath the surface. He didn't like being questioned, and he definitely didn't like losing control. I started looking into his past. It wasn't easy, Magnus was careful, and there wasn't much information about him online. But eventually, I found an old newspaper article from Everwood. It was about a man who had been arrested for assault after a violent bar fight. The name wasn't Magnus, but the photo was undeniably him. According to the article, he changed his name after serving time. I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. If Magnus had a criminal past, what else was he hiding? And why had he kept his connection to Everwood a secret? At this point, I was unraveling. I needed answers. I dug deeper into the letters, the article, and every scrap of information I could find about Magnus. Slowly, the pieces started coming together. The man Arthur warned my parents about wasn't just some vague threat. It was Magnus. Before I was born, Magnus had been obsessed with my mom. When she rejected him, he started stalking her, showing up at her house uninvited, and even threatening her. My dad confronted him, which led to the bar fight that got him arrested. After that, my parents fled Everwood, hoping Magnus wouldn't find them. But he did. And instead of going after them directly, he wormed his way into our lives through Talita. I haven't confronted Magnus yet. I don't know how to. My world feels like it's been flipped upside down, and every time I look at him, all I can see is the man my parents tried so hard to protect me from. I don't know what I'm going to do next, but I know this: Magnus doesn't belong in our lives anymore. He never did. After finding out everything, I couldn't look at Magnus the same way. Every memory I had of him, teaching me to drive, helping me with my first job, being there for my family, felt tainted. He wasn't the hero I thought he was. He was a predator who had spent years lying to everyone around him. I knew I couldn't let this slide. I needed to protect my sister and her kids, the way my parents had tried to protect me. But more than that, I wanted him to pay. I started planning carefully. Magnus was too smart for me to confront directly. He'd just deny everything or twist the story to make himself the victim. I needed proof that would expose him for what he truly was. Something undeniable, something that would ruin his reputation and ensure he could never hurt my family again. The first step was getting Talita on my side. I knew she wouldn't believe me unless I had solid evidence, so I showed her everything: the letters, the newspaper article, and even some records I dug up that linked Magnus to incidents in Everwood. At first, she was in denial. She cried, she yelled at me, and she even accused me of trying to destroy her marriage out of jealousy. But after a few days, the truth started to sink in. One night, when the kids were asleep, Talita called me. Her voice was shaking. "Silas," she said, "if what you're saying is true, what do we do now?" I told her we needed to be smart. Magnus had built a reputation in Ashwood Hollow as a stand-up guy. If we confronted him without proof, he'd just turn everyone against us. But if we could expose him publicly, in a way he couldn't deny, his entire world would come crashing down. The next step was gathering more dirt on Magnus. I started reaching out to people in Everwood who might have known him back in the day. It wasn't easy, most people were hesitant to talk about him, and some didn't even remember him. But then I got lucky. A woman named Marjorie, who had lived down the street from my parents in Everwood, agreed to meet with me. Marjorie was in her 60s, sharp as a tack, and had no love for Magnus. She told me about how he used to stalk my mom, how he'd sit outside her house for hours and even break in once when my dad was out of town. She said everyone in the neighborhood knew he was trouble, but no one could do much about it until my dad finally got him arrested after the bar fight. "Your parents were terrified of him," Marjorie said. "When they left Everwood, they didn't tell anyone where they were going. They just disappeared." Marjorie even had an old restraining order my mom had filed against Magnus, which she let me take. It was exactly what I needed, a legal document tying him directly to the stalking. With the restraining order in hand, I started putting the pieces together. Magnus had used his charm to manipulate Talita and ingratiate himself into our family. He wasn't just a liar, he was dangerous. And now, I had proof. I decided it was time to hit him where it hurt the most: his reputation. Magnus had always prided himself on being the town hero. Everyone in Ashwood Hollow thought of him as the guy who would drop everything to help a neighbor in need. I knew that tearing down that image would destroy him. So, with Talita's permission, I started quietly sharing what I'd found with people in town. It started small. I told a few trusted neighbors about Magnus's past, showing them the restraining order and the newspaper article. Word spread quickly. Within a few weeks, the rumors were everywhere. People started asking Magnus questions he couldn't answer. He tried to brush it off, claiming it was all a misunderstanding, but the evidence was too damning. The more he denied it, the guiltier he looked. Then came the final blow. Talita and I compiled everything we had: letters, articles, the restraining order, and statements from people who knew Magnus in Everwood, and sent it to the local newspaper. The editor, a woman named Beatrice, was horrified when she read it. She agreed to run a story exposing Magnus's past, complete with all the evidence we'd provided. When the article came out, it was like a bomb went off in Ashwood Hollow. Magnus went from being the town hero to the town pariah overnight. People he'd known for years refused to speak to him. Clients canceled contracts with his construction business. Parents wouldn't let their kids near him. But the revenge didn't stop there. Talita filed for divorce and got a restraining order to keep Magnus away from her and the kids. She also got full custody, thanks to the mountain of evidence we had against him. Magnus tried to fight it, but he didn't stand a chance. He ended up leaving Ashwood Hollow, tail between his legs, with nothing but his truck and a bag of tools. As far as I know, he hasn't been back since. For the first time in years, I feel like my family is safe. Talita and the kids are doing better than ever, and the shadow Magnus cast over our lives is finally gone. I still think about my parents sometimes, and I wonder if they ever suspected Magnus would come back into our lives. I like to think they'd be proud of how we handled things. Magnus thought he could control us, but in the end, we took everything from him. And honestly, I don't regret a thing. Story 2. My name is Rufus, and I've always been the quieter one in the family. I grew up in Gatlinburg, Tennessee, a small, scenic town that feels like it belongs in a storybook. My older brother, Ezekiel, Zeke to everyone else, was the opposite of me in every way. Zeke was loud, charming, the kind of guy who could talk his way out of anything. Growing up, I always felt like I was living in his shadow. He was Mom and Dad's favorite, the one who could do no wrong. And for the most part, I was fine with that. We weren't close, but we were family. When our parents passed away, I was 23 and Zeke was 27. They didn't leave much behind, just the house, which Zeke sold off almost immediately, and a few sentimental things. I remember thinking it was odd how quickly he got over their deaths, but I figured everyone grieves differently. Years went by, and Zeke and I drifted apart. I bought a little fixer-upper cabin near the Smoky Mountains. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and I spent most of my free time working on it. Life was quiet, just the way I liked it. I wasn't rich by any means, but I was responsible. A couple of years after moving in, I decided to get a life insurance policy. Nothing huge, just enough to cover funeral costs and a little extra for whoever I left behind. Since I didn't have a wife or kids, I named Zeke as my beneficiary. It seemed logical at the time. He was my brother, my only family. Last year, everything started to change. Zeke showed up at my door one evening, looking rough. He'd lost his job, was going through a messy divorce, and had debts piling up. He said he needed a place to stay for a few weeks until he got back on his feet. I didn't think twice about saying yes. He was my brother, and family helps family, right? At first, it was fine. He slept on the couch, helped out with a few projects around the house, and even cooked dinner a few times. But then things started to feel off. He would disappear for hours without saying where he was going. He spent a lot of time on the phone, talking in hushed tones. When I'd ask him what was going on, he'd brush it off, saying he was handling some stuff. I didn't push. I figured he was dealing with his divorce or his debts. It wasn't my business. But then he started asking weird questions. One night, we were watching TV, and out of nowhere, he asked, "How much is your life insurance worth again?" I told him, joking that he better not get any ideas. He laughed, but there was something about the way he looked at me that made my stomach tighten. The questions didn't stop. A few days later, he asked if the policy covered accidental death. Another time, he wanted to know if anyone else knew he was my beneficiary. It was strange, but I still didn't connect the dots. I thought maybe he was thinking about getting his own policy or something. Looking back, I feel so stupid for not realizing sooner. The moment I knew something was really wrong came late one night. I was in bed, half asleep, when I heard Zeke on the phone in the living room. His voice was low, but I could hear enough to make out what he was saying. He said, "It'll look like an accident. No one will ever know." I froze. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might wake him up. I didn't know what to do. Who was he talking to? What accident? 1,000 thoughts raced through my mind, but I told myself I was overreacting. Maybe he was talking about something else entirely. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to install a hidden camera in the living room. It wasn't hard, I just hid it behind a fake plant on a shelf. I didn't actually think I'd catch anything. I just wanted to ease my paranoia. What I saw on that footage still gives me nightmares. The first night, Zeke went into the kitchen and opened one of my beers. He poured something into it from a small bottle, shook it around, and then put it back in the fridge. The next day, he offered me that exact beer. I made up an excuse about not feeling like drinking, and he shrugged it off, but I could tell he was irritated. Another night, he stood over my bed while I was sleeping. He just stood there, holding one of my pillows in his hands. He stood there for what felt like forever before putting the pillow back down and walking away. Watching that on the footage made me feel sick. What would have happened if I'd woken up? Would I even be here to tell this story? I knew I couldn't confront him. If he was willing to kill me for money, there was no telling what he'd do if he realized I was onto him. I went to the police the next morning. They didn't laugh me off or tell me I was imagining things. They took one look at the footage and got serious fast. The next part happened so quickly it felt surreal. The police helped me set a trap. I went home and acted like everything was normal. That evening, while Zeke was out, I packed a bag and went to stay at a hotel. I didn't want to be in the house when they arrested him. When they showed up to arrest him, Zeke lost it. He started yelling, accusing me of betraying him, calling me a liar. He swore he didn't do anything, that the footage was fake. But the evidence was undeniable. After Zeke was arrested, I thought I'd feel relief, but instead, I felt empty. This was my brother. The guy I'd shared a childhood with. How could he do this to me? How could he look me in the eyes, laugh at my jokes, eat the meals I cooked, and all the while be planning to kill me? The police assured me they had everything they needed to put him away. But I wasn't satisfied. I didn't just want Zeke behind bars, I wanted everyone to know what he'd done. I wanted him to feel the weight of his betrayal every single day. The trial started a few months later. Zeke's lawyer tried everything to get the charges dropped. He argued that the footage was tampered with, that I'd set him up, that I was the crazy one. They even tried to paint me as a loner obsessed with conspiracy theories. But none of it stuck. When the prosecution played the footage in court, the room went dead silent. People gasped when they saw him pouring something into my beer. They audibly cringed when they saw him standing over my bed with a pillow. The jury looked disgusted, and even his own lawyer seemed rattled. It was all there, clear as day. No amount of excuses could explain it away. When it was my turn to testify, I didn't hold back. I told them everything, how I took him in when he had nowhere else to go, how I ignored the warning signs because I wanted to believe the best in him, and how I finally realized he was willing to kill me for a payout. I looked Zeke in the eyes the entire time I spoke, but he wouldn't look back. He just sat there, staring at the table. What really sealed Zeke's fate wasn't just the footage. It was the pills he used. The prosecution had them tested, and they were lethal. A single dose would have been enough to kill me, and there were traces of the same substance found in the beer he tampered with. There was no way to spin that. He had planned this for weeks, maybe even months. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. They came back with a guilty verdict on all charges: attempted murder, poisoning, and premeditation. When the judge sentenced him to 30 years without parole, I felt a weight lift off my chest. But I wasn't done yet. Zeke's conviction was only the beginning. I wanted him to face the consequences in more ways than one. I reached out to everyone he knew, his ex-wife, old friends, former co-workers. I shared the story and the footage with them. I wanted them to see who Zeke really was. The charming, smooth-talking guy they thought they knew? That was a lie. The real Zeke was a cold-blooded snake who tried to kill his own brother for money. Word spread fast in Gatlinburg. It's a small town, and people talk. Zeke became a pariah overnight. His ex-wife used the conviction to push for full custody of their kids. His old friends stopped taking his calls. Even the guys he used to drink with at the local bar refused to associate with him. Zeke had always cared about his reputation more than anything, and now it was in shreds. But I didn't stop there. I took the footage of Zeke standing over me with a pillow and turned it into a lesson. I partnered with a local crime prevention group to create a PSA about spotting the warning signs of domestic betrayal. It played on local TV stations and even made its way onto social media. Every time someone saw that video, they saw Zeke's face. His actions became a public example of how greed can destroy lives. From what I hear, Zeke's life in prison hasn't been easy. Word got around about why he was there, and apparently, even hardened criminals don't take kindly to someone who tried to kill their own brother. I don't feel bad for him. He made his bed, and now he has to lie in it. It's been over a year since the trial, and I'm finally starting to feel like myself again. I sold the cabin. I couldn't live there anymore after everything that happened. I moved to a quieter part of town and got a dog for company. His name is Bear, and he's the best decision I've ever made. I also changed my life insurance policy. The new beneficiary? A local animal shelter. I don't have much family left, but I'd rather my money go to saving stray dogs and cats than ever risk it falling into the wrong hands again. I've started therapy to deal with the trauma, and it's helped a lot. I don't wake up in the middle of the night as much anymore, and I'm learning to trust people again, slowly, but surely. I've even reconnected with a few old friends I'd lost touch with over the years. Life is starting to feel normal again. If there's one thing I've learned from all this, it's that betrayal can come from the people you least expect. I never in a million years thought my own brother would try to kill me, but he did. I trusted him because he was family, and he used that trust against me. It's a hard lesson, but it's one I won't forget. I also learned the importance of listening to your gut. If something feels off, it probably is. Don't ignore the red flags like I did. Trust your instincts, and don't be afraid to protect yourself, even if it means hurting someone you care about. As for Zeke, I don't waste much energy thinking about him anymore. He's where he belongs, and I'm free to live my life without looking over my shoulder. That's all the revenge I need.